Hello, and welcome to the Vantage Deployment on Virtual Machines demo. Today we're going to install Vantage on-prem on Linux virtual machines. Vantage deployment is a fairly intuitive process if you are already familiar with Docker and know how to manage Docker containers. If you have never worked with containerized architectures before, you can still deploy Vantage by carefully following the instructions of the System Administrator's Guide, as well as using this video for guidance. However, for future Vantage maintenance, the Vantage admin needs to have expertise in Linux, Docker, and Kubernetes. Before we start, let me describe the environment that we have prepared for this Vantage deployment. By now, you should know that depending on the expected Vantage productivity and fault tolerance installation options, Vantage can be deployed in both a high available configuration and without high availability configuration. The highly available configuration can be created by using an additional Redis cluster. For training purposes, we don't need a highly available installation. We also do not need several Vantage worker machines, as we're not going to process up to 50,000 pages within 8 hours. Our goal today is to simply show you the deployment process. This is why we will be installing the minimum possible Vantage configuration. This means that for our Kubernetes cluster, we need to prepare only 3 virtual machines. At the same time, remember that the deployment process for larger workloads is the same. As we stated in the course, Vantage is a set of Docker containers managed by a Kubernetes service. One of the steps of deploying Vantage on virtual machines is the automatic installation of the Kubernetes service, so you don't need to configure the Kubernetes cluster on your own before deployment. Taking into account what we've just said, we will now briefly discuss the structure of our demo Vantage deployment. First of all, we prepared the following virtual machines. The administrator's VM. We will use it to perform the deployment. This can be any machine, Linux, or Windows running on the Windows subsystem for Linux. And, of course, you'll need Docker running on this machine to download Vantage container images and start the installation container. In our training environment, the admin's VM is an Ubuntu VM with the name training-admin. The next pre-configured VM is a machine with SQL Server. The SQL Server is needed by Vantage to store internal data. In our environment, this is an Ubuntu VM with the name training-db. By the way, all our VMs are running on Ubuntu 20.04, which is a requirement for the Kubernetes cluster nodes. To simplify the environment creation, we use this operating system for all our machines. So on the SQL Server VM, we deployed a Microsoft SQL Server 2019 for Linux, which is required for Vantage. Also, we enabled the full-text search feature, also needed by Vantage. You can find all the requirements for Vantage deployment in the System Administrator's Guide. We will refer to this guide a lot during this demo to get the code samples for our demo deployment. Okay, the next prepared VM in our training environment is called training-registry. On this VM, we installed a Harbor container registry. Now, the VMs for the Kubernetes cluster. The first VM in our environment is called Training Master, and we are going to use this VM for Kubernetes master nodes. The next VM, Training Services, is used for Kubernetes worker nodes for Vantage services. This is the biggest VM in the training environment. More than 500 gigabytes of hard disk drive space is allocated for this machine because we'll perform the default deployment. This means that an NFS storage is installed along with Vantage, and this storage will be automatically deployed on the Kubernetes worker nodes for the Vantage service machine. The last VM in our infrastructure is called Training-Worker1. This is the machine dedicated for Kubernetes worker nodes for Vantage workers. Depending on your planned Vantage workload, you may have more machines as Vantage workers. As we mentioned before, for the purpose of this demonstration, we only have one Vantage worker. I want to briefly discuss 3 topics before we start installing Vantage. First, on all 3 cluster VMs, we created a user Ansible added the SSH key file generated on the admin's VM, and disabled the password for sudo. This all is needed for the installer container to have access to these VMs and be able to automatically deploy a Kubernetes cluster first and then Vantage itself. We have prepared beforehand the DNS record and SSL certificates for our container registry, which is training-registry.abby.com, and for the demo Vantage installation, training-vantage.abby.com. Also, we have prepared 2 static IP addresses, one for the Kubernetes cluster and one for Vantage. And third, for Vantage to function properly, an SMTP server is required. In our training demo, we will simply connect to ABBYY's SMTP server. Okay, this is all that I needed to tell you about the training infrastructure configuration. Now, let's begin. I'm using my Windows PowerShell to connect to the admin's VM, and I'll connect via SSH. Here we go. I'm now inside the admin's VM. We will follow the deployment steps according to the instructions in the admin's guide. First, we need to create an installation directory. Here's sample code for this. Let me copy this code, then paste it into my PowerShell. Okay, the installation directory has been created, and I'm inside this directory. Now, back to the admin's guide. Here, we need to save the SSH key file generated on the admin's machine with the name Ansible. Then, this file should be placed in the SSH subfolder of the installation directory. I have this Ansible file with the SSH key in my home Ansible directory on the admin's VM. So now I will copy this file into the installation folder vantage-install. Here we go. Good. Again, I'll open the admin's guide to find what we need to do next. Step number 3, we need to create an inventory file. You can download the example here. I already have it on my computer. Here it is. In the inventory file, we need to provide the IP addresses of the future Kubernetes cluster nodes. Let's do this. I'm providing the IP address of my training master VM, which is dedicated for Kubernetes master nodes here. Okay. Now the IP address of the machine for Kubernetes worker nodes for Vantage services. And the IP address of the machine for Kubernetes worker nodes for Vantage workers. As we have only one worker in our deployment, I'll simply delete these 2 entries. If you need to increase the Vantage production workload, or if you want to deploy additional GPU workers for deep learning training, you can add them here. Okay, our inventory file is ready. I'll transfer it into the home Ansible directory of the admin's VM, and now let's just put this file into the installation folder. Here we go. I'll check what's inside. Sure enough, along with the Kube, SSL, and SSH subfolders, we have the inventory file here. Good. Now let's go back to the instructions in the admin's guide. The next step is to create and edit the env-specific YAML file. Again, you can download the sample file here. I'll open this one that I've already downloaded. So let's provide our environment parameters here. First, the domain and installation scope. As I mentioned earlier, we have created a DNS record for this Vantage deployment. It is training-vantage.abby.com. In the env-specific.yaml file, you need to specify this Vantage DNS name in 2 parts. Here, under the env, we need to put the subdomain name. In my case, this is training-vantage. Then here, in the domain section, I'll put the domain name, ABBYY.com in my case. There is this POC parameter set to true by default. I'll not change it. POC literally stands for proof of concept and is equal to the without high availability deployment, which is correct for this demo installation. If you deploy the highly available configuration, change this parameter to false. Also, I'm not changing the product host parameter. It consists of two parts, env and domain, divided by a period. And this is exactly the hostname of our future Vantage installation, training-vantage.abby.com. Now, logging options. I don't have Kibana and Elasticsearch deployed, so I don't need to provide the Elasticsearch connection parameters. File logs are enabled by default here. This means that I do not need to change this part of the env-specific YAML file. Let's continue. The load balancer external IP address is the IP address of the deployed Vantage, so here I'm putting the correct IP address. The K8's API IP parameter specifies the IP address, which is dedicated for the future Kubernetes cluster, so I'll provide this IP address here. I'm not changing the TechCore parameters as I don't need the additional GPU workers deployed, as well as the neural network extraction training workers. But if your Vantage deployment requires any of those, simply change the values here to true. Next, the platform admin email. I'm providing my email address here. Now, the container registry parameters. I'll put here my container registry DNS address. It's training-registry.abby.com. Then the username, in my case this is admin, and here I'm providing the password. I will leave the container registry name parameter unchanged because I created a directory with the name Vantage inside my container registry. Let me show you. I'll open my container registry using its address, login, and here you can see I have the directory Vantage. This is where I'm going to upload the Vantage container images. Now, if you want to copy the container images into the root directory of your container registry, then here you need to delete the /Vantage. Okay, good. Now wait a bit while I'm providing the connection credentials to the SMTP server. I'm using the recommended connection option with login and password. If you decide to use this connection without login and password, you need to change this part of the env-specific YAML file as described in the admin's guide here. Okay, good. Just one more step is needed, and this is the connection parameters to the SQL Server. I'm providing the SQL Server IP address, the username, in my case it's Vantage, and the password. Okay, cool. As I'm not installing the Business Processing Reporting Warehouse and the Identity Documents add-on, I will not change the reporting and ID reading parameters of the env-specific YAML file. Now I need to save this file and then transfer it to the admin's VM, which I've done. And here, from the admin's VM, I'll put our recently created env-specific YAML file into the Vantage install folder. Here we go. Again, I'll go back to the admin's guide to find out the next step. It says, prepare certificates. I already have the SSL certificate files, key.pem and cert.pem, in my home/Ansible folder on the admin's VM. Let's place these certificate files in the SSL subfolder of the Vantage-install directory. Very good. We are almost ready for the deployment. The next step is to download the container images. To download the images, you need to have their names. These names are listed in the images.list file. I have downloaded this file and put it into the home/Ansible directory of the admin's VM. Now I need to create a script that will go over all the images listed in the images.list file and copy them into my container registry. So I'm creating a text file. Here in the admin's guide, I take the sample script and copy it. Now in this script, I only need to provide the path to the images.list file, here. For me, it's home/Ansible. Then I'll provide my container registry address in this parameter, dst_registry. Good. You do not need to change anything else in this code. The Vantage_registry variable contains the address of the ABBYY public container registry. This address should not be changed. What does this script do? For each image listed in the images.list file, the script pulls the image from the ABBYY public container registry, then tags this image in the admin's machine Docker, then pushes this image into our local container registry. Then the script finds the image ID in Docker and deletes this image from Docker running on the admin's VM. This way, the admin's VM is used as a buffer between the ABBYY public container registry and our local container registry. I'll add one more line to the script. It's echo all done. This allows me to know when the image download process is completed. Okay, good. I'll save this file with the name import_images.sh, then I'll put it in the home/Ansible directory of the admin's VM. And now let's place this file in the Vantage Deployment folder. At this point, we're ready to synchronize the Vantage deployment images. For this, first we need to connect to the ABBYY public container registry. Here's the sample code. We don't need to change anything in this code, but we need to remember to add sudo at the beginning. Okay, let's run it. Good. It says login succeeded. Now, to be able to push images into my Harbor container registry, I need to connect to it. I'm using the same sample code, but this time I'm going to edit it. So I'll paste this code into a text editor, and then I'll change the registry name here, username here, and the password. Now I'll execute this Docker login command. Here we go. We got the login succeeded response. And now I only need to run the bash script we edited earlier. So sudo bash import_images.sh and run. Okay, it's running. You can see the images have been pooled. It takes approximately 30 minutes to an hour to synchronize the images. You can open the local container registry to see images as they're being added to the repository. In this demo video, we have edited this process out and are continuing from the point when all the images have been downloaded. So you can see the all done response. The images are downloaded. Let me open the container registry now and show you the images. Here, there's the Vantage K8's 2-3.2 image. This is the Vantage installation container. It is packed with pre-configured playbooks that will perform the Vantage deployment. We will execute the installation from within this container. Let's start this container. In the admin's guide, you can find the sample command to run the installer here. I'll copy this code to the text editor. Here, I only need to provide my container registry address. Okay. See, this code not only runs the container, but also mounts folders between the admin's VM and the installer container. This way, my prepared files will be automatically placed in their corresponding directories. Here you can see that the env-specific YAML file, for example, is stored in the ansible/inventories/k8/group_vars/all directory inside the installer container. And when the Kubernetes cluster is deployed, the cluster configuration config file, which is stored by default in the /root/kube folder in the installation container, will be automatically transferred to the /opt/vantage-install/kube folder of the admin's VM. $pwd in this code indicates the current working directory on the admin's VM. In our case, it's /opt/vantage-install. Okay, good. Now let's copy the command and execute it. Here, bash-4.4 indicates that I'm inside the installer container now. At this point, I have only a few commands to run to get Vantage deployed. The first command can be found here. This change mode command sets the correct permissions to the SSH key file. In our case, it's called Ansible. These permissions are required by the installer to access the cluster nodes. So let's run this command. Good. Now we will use the pre-configured playbook to deploy the Kubernetes cluster. Here's the command. Let's run it. The cluster is being deployed. It takes up to 5 minutes to install the Kubernetes cluster. Again, we've cut this out and are continuing from the point when the cluster has been installed. Alright, all's good. Let's continue. The next playbook for us to run is called Preflight Check, and it is used to check whether all the resources that we provided in the env-specific YAML file are accessible by the installer. Here, I'm running this playbook. It takes some time before it's done. If this playbook finishes with errors, you must fix them before proceeding with the Vantage deployment. Usually, it's pretty obvious which resources have problems from the error messages that you see after executing the Preflight Check playbook. In my case, there aren't any issues and we can continue to install Vantage. Here is one more pre-installation playbook called Legal. Before deploying Vantage, we must accept the ABBYY privacy policy and the end user license agreement. Without the accepted privacy policy in EULA, Vantage won't install. So let's do this. I'm typing yes to accept the EULA. And once again, I'm typing yes to accept the ABBYY privacy policy. Good. Now, this last playbook, Site Deploy, that will install Vantage for us. Let's go. It takes approximately 10 minutes to deploy Vantage. While Vantage is being installed, I will open the Lens utility. I've already connected to our Kubernetes cluster using the kube/config file from Lens. Here you see the cluster nodes. If you switch to the Workloads option, under the Overview tab, you can choose the namespace. Here you see the Vantage namespace. It's empty for now because the installer first deploys some additional components, for example, the NFS storage, then the Vantage infrastructure namespace will appear, and the installer deploys the infrastructure. Then the monitoring namespace appears. Eventually, we will wait for all the ABBYY Vantage pods to be running and all the jobs completed. Here, you might see some warnings or errors if they appear. Okay, again, we have edited out the rest of the deployment process to keep this demo moving along. And now we're there. The playbook has completed, and in the response, you can find your deployed Vantage instance admin's credentials here. Now let's run our newly deployed Vantage. Here is the URL. Now we need to provide the admin's email address and the password. Voila! We are working in the Vantage Admins interface. Now you can create tenants and users. They'll receive automatic emails with their credentials to Vantage. That's it. We have successfully deployed Vantage on virtual machines. As you witnessed, this is not an overly difficult task, provided that you have a properly pre-configured environment. Thanks for watching, and best wishes for your own Vantage installation project.